We'd like to now welcome our next panel, including the 10th Director of the Congressional Budget Office, one of our hosts here for this event, Phill Swagel. He is joined by a number of his predecessors as they get on the dais: Dan Crippen, Doug Elmendorf, Keith Hall, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, Robert Reischauer. And let me also welcome another colleague from thehill.com and NewsNation, Mike Viqueira. He is a veteran congressional and White House reporter. He is now the Washington Bureau Chief for NewsNation here in Washington. The panel will get underway momentarily. Thank you all for being with us. Oh. Yeah. No matter what I drink, it's not going to make me any smarter. Well, this is great, and I don't feel I deserve to be moderating such a distinguished panel. Seriously, uh, Doug, you go right with that chair there. You want me to? um, well, this is really an extraordinary moment because, as Bill Hoagland and Margaret have pointed out, the 50th anniversary of the Budget and Impoundment Act, as Bill Hoagland continually reminds me that that is the full title. As a reporter who spent 12 years every day in the halls of Congress, the CBO is something that I spent hours waiting for the result of perhaps your most visible work product when it comes to reporters, and that is, what is the score on the legislation? Because when you were directors of the CBO, you all had to be careful about what you told your client, which was the members of Congress, about the policy choices and trade-offs they made. So you either play the role of hero or villain. You're either an impartial and principled caller of balls and strikes, or you're a misguided bureaucrat using faulty economic assumptions. And that depends on the agenda of the person sitting in judgment of you. So during your tenure, CBO could also serve as a convenient scapegoat for members of Congress who might not be able to pass legislation, depending on how you scored it, how you evaluated it, and the costs of it. So we want to discuss your time at CBO and remind you that, with the exception of the gentleman to my right here, is the current director. You are unbound from Congress today. So, oh no! In short, you can tell me. Tempting. Yeah, well, please let loose, man. So please, this is your opportunity to tell us what you really think. But I am going to start with perhaps, I guess, to use the parlance of today, the OG of the CBO, Mr. Reischauer, at the end of our table here. I remember I started as a journalist in this town as a producer for NHK Japan Broadcasting. Reischauer was a famous name in Japan, owing to your father's work. And then Reischauer was a famous name in my work because we were very focused on the product of the CBO and the economic assumptions that you made. So tell me, you were at the beginning with Alice Rivlin, the creation of the CBO. How do you see the changes in the mission now and the different challenges that are faced by Phill and what you faced back in the 90s?
Well, back when CBO started, uh, it wasn't as big a thing. And I tell a little story, which I probably shouldn't tell, which is the deputy director of CBO came up on the Hill about in year 2 or 1.5, and was walking along and ran into his classmate in graduate school. And the classmate in graduate school said, what are you doing up here? You're usually in California. And he said, well, I'm the deputy director of CBO. And this individual said, who's a member, what's that? And he explained what it was. That individual ended up, his name will go unreported here, as one of the leaders in Congress. I mean, one of the top leaders in Congress. And it shows you we weren't a big deal. We were a big deal for the appropriations committees, the Ways and Means Committee, because we were in their turf, so to speak. But the job was relatively easy compared to what it was. Were there hostilities? Sure, I got called up all the time by a ranting member who didn't want to trust this important rant to one of his staff and screamed at. Then you hold the phone a little bit away, and it went on. And the next day, I'd be on the podium, and he'd be giving a speech as well. And he'd say, "You guys do terrific work." And so you might start out with the hide of a rhinoceros to survive in this job, but pretty soon, you know, your skin's tough, and you realize that the vast majority of members uh, are supportive, as the individuals who are on this panel, supportive of CBO, what it's doing, realize that they and their interests might be affected negatively today, but the institution as a whole was better off in that there was agreement on certain basics of economics, fiscal policy, and policy analysis.
Okay, I'm just going to ask the group, and you can answer one by one, or argue, or speak over each other, or agree with each other. And I mean, again, I'll use my experience as a reporter from the perspective of someone who's reporting to the public. It used to be when the CBO, the budget was released, there was a big lineup before dawn at that big brick monolith down at North Capitol Street, the government printing office, and everybody wanted to get the first look at the budget. Now, granted, it's online now, so you don't need this gigantic dead tree edition of the budget. And there was a photo op when the budget was delivered to the Hill. I remember watching Jim Nussle walk in with the budget, and we all took pictures of him. It seems less relevant to the discussion now. And I'm wondering why that is, and whether or not that is something that should be rectified. Dan Crippen.
Why do I have to start?
Because you're next to Mr. Reischauer.
I always got put at the front of the class because of my last name. I mean,
Oh, yeah,
never
okay.
fair either. Well, as we've all said, everyone has said here before us too, the times have changed. The budget is not as relevant because it is not part of the discussion. And for your colleagues and your past, it is contention that gets reported. And while we certainly have contention on the budget, if you go seek it out, it's not what makes the headlines. It's not what has your interest or reporters' interest. And so it's not as big a deal in that sense. And as the panel before us, a couple of members talked about, when you have $2 trillion deficits, somehow it's unreal.
Yeah.
You know, it's different if you're 60 billion away and you can put that in the context of the programs.
Yeah.
But 1.7 or 2 or whatever the big numbers are don't have relevance to people and therefore reporting.
But just aside from the news value and what I do, isn't it also a reflection of the fact that current resolutions don't get passed anymore? And so it becomes less, the process is, as has been noted here, seems to be broken. Doug.
So first of all, thanks for the chance to be here. Years ago, I ran into former Governor Michael Dukakis at TSA screening at the Reagan Airport.
Oh, yeah?
I said, "Governor, thank you for your service." And he looked at me and goes, "Thanks for remembering." That's how I feel today. Thanks for remembering. So I'm going to just steal from Phil Joyce, who's sitting over here somewhere. He was in the process of finalizing a very nice paper on this topic. And one of the things that I think that he writes that I think is absolutely true is that CBO as an institution killed off OMB and the interest in the president's budget. It used to be that you needed the OMB numbers, you needed the president's budget. It set the tone for all the discussions that we're going to happen in Congress. That's not true anymore. Congress wrested control of the budget from the executive branch with this act.
Right.
I wish they would now possess it more fondly and take care of it a little bit. But that was the whole point. The whole point was to take control of budgetary deliberations. And now they don't want to own it. And that's the fundamental problem.
Which results in CRs and omnibuses and Doug, what's Mr. Elmendorf, what's lost? What's lost in that?
When I got to CBO, my colleagues, some of whom are here in the room, would refer to me as Doug 2. I'm happy to be here with Doug and in the Rayburn building. A little odd to be sitting on this side of a hearing room.
You're telling me.
Seen well, so I think what I cared about as director were the budget plans of the members of Congress for whom I worked. And the president's budget was interesting, but not central to the work of that day. What I think what we've lost through not having budget plans that are taken seriously from the administration or from members of Congress is we're not setting strategy. We're simply trying to survive. We as a budget making government trying to survive from one day to the next, and that's no way to run a serious government.
But the point, as was pointed out, is that the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974 was an effort to take control, the power of the purse back to the Congress, to the people and the representatives here, Keith. What have you found to be lacking in the process, and what do you think should be done to correct it?
Well, it's not followed,
Yeah.
right? And I think I even hate to focus on the process because it's a process you don't follow. So you're going to fix something and then not follow it. You're not going to fix it.
How do we get people to follow it?
Well, and at danger of changing the subject a little bit, I think the biggest problem with the budget is we lost our fear of debt. And we lost our fear of debt with low interest rates at the Great Recession. Because for decades, we ran a debt around 40%, up and down. And when recessions would hit, we'd be afraid of running the debt up. So we'd let monetary policy work. And low interest rates made us think, okay, and this is part of the advice Congress got, low interest rates means the Fed's not going to be able to handle it. You're going to have to use fiscal policy. And we used it big time in the Great Recession. We used it big time in the pandemic. And all this debt that we've got now grew from that Great Recession. We had debt of about 40%. It was hovering about 40%. We're at 100% now because we just don't fear debt. And so whatever happens with the budget process and anything else, if you don't fear debt, then it doesn't matter that much.
I see, Phil, you furiously taking notes there, so I'm just going to let you.
I just writing down some thoughts on what's the same and what's different, which is kind of and obviously some of it's from me and some of it's from talking to colleagues, many of whom are here. And I should just first say I benefited from everything they did. I mean, it's really an amazing group. It's really spectacular. And I know we're missing some other spectacular people, including of course Al Sirlin of blessed memory. And so, I've benefited from everything. Sometimes as we joke, we're still cleaning up your messes. Oh yeah, that's at Elmendorf. Yeah. Actually, I did once say, oh yeah, that was Doug's fault. And the staff I was talking to got it.
It's Doug's fault.
It worked. That worked. That worked. So I'll only just say quickly the same. And it's there's so much that's really from Alice, and it's the mission, it's the analysis and process. And of course, the people, for who, when there's the friction, is of course the people who already know the answer, right? If you already, you have the tablets from Mount Sinai, you don't need us to tell you, well, you don't really care what the analysis is. So that I think that's the same, and I know from my colleagues and my predecessors that those frictions are familiar. Getting the answer in the time available is not always getting it right, but getting it in the time available, landing the plane on the runway. And of course, people want it faster. I'll say the thing that's still the same also is the culture and the people. And I'm looking out and I see so many CBO alumni. I bet you could come back and still feel at home. And if you know anything about the Farm Bill, we'd put you to work right away. More dangerous than you think. So a lot of that is still the same. There's so much that is still the same. And actually that helped us so much making it through the pandemic and through the remote, the period of remote work through the pandemic. A few things that are slightly different. And again, this is just a matter of degree. One is transparency, which I inherited everything. I benefited from everything they did, and especially Keith really pushed this, and we've continued. And it's, we're still continuing, so we're sort of in the middle of the slope, but it's really been a big, I think it's a good thing for CBO. And then I think this is really a matter of degree, is the way we work. And when I talk to some of my colleagues, that's what they say, is that sometimes the process of our work is maybe more iterative, or the faster iteration, which it's always been that way, but it's that somehow the thought was that the process of technical assistance is different. And maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's a splintering of the Congress, and we're dealing with multiple sides, with multiple committees in the same, in the same chamber. And so I'm not sure, but that, that is, that's something that many of my colleagues have observed. Just feels different in the way we work.
Okay. I'm going to go deep into the weeds here, at least from my perspective. In this room, it's not in the weeds at all, I'm sure, and that is the subject of dun 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 dynamic scoring. So it seems to be a recurring issue, not just on the tax side of the equation, but on the spending side as well. Recently, the House passed a bill requiring CBO to help lawmakers evaluate the impact of preventive health care legislation. So I understand, Director Swagel, you've testified that the CBO is well positioned to take this out. So what is the status of that debate now? Is that pretty much given now that dynamic scoring is going to be implemented or used whenever making scoring estimates?
Okay, maybe I'll just say a little bit. I know
Okay.
others will chime in. And we built on their efforts, and we're doing it. And the agency did it actually just before my time for the 2017 Tax Act. We did it for immigration, which was Doug 2. Yeah, Doug 2. Immigration, we're doing it again. We're looking at dynamic effects with other things. If there's major legislation, of course, the House rules tell us to do it, and we certainly would do it. And importantly, we're looking beyond the 10-year budget window, since of course there's so many policies that have long-term effects in healthcare and in other things. So that's another aspect of a change.
Anyone else?
I would say I think it's important for CBO to extend dynamic analysis to more legislative proposals. I thought that when I was at CBO and we did some work in that direction. I wrote a Brookings paper as soon as I finished advocating some of that. I'm actually writing a Brookings paper for the September conference with Glenn Hubbard and Heidi Williams. We hope will help CBO to constructively engage on more sorts of dynamic scoring. This is super hard to do in many ways, and having lived through trying to do this in some cases, I understand the difficulty of that. But I also think that there are a lot of legislative proposals for which one gets a somewhat different sense of the impact on the budget by incorporating more effects for which there is a growing body of economic evidence. And so I think done cautiously, in the right circumstances, more of that would be useful for the Congress in making decisions.
Anyone else on
But
that?
I've always thought that, and I led the first dynamic score at CBO. It was essentially a litmus test of my appointment as director at that time.
How so?
That the next director should do a dynamic score. Dynamic scoring is going to save the republic, and we're going to cut taxes and end teenage pregnancies and God knows what else.
With dynamic
We're
scoring.
good. Yes, it's all good. And so we did it, and the central features of the president's budget that year were the 2003 tax cuts. That's what they wanted, and it was also the Medicare Modernization Act. The Part D prescription drug program was in that same president's budget, and we concluded that it would have a modest effects somewhere around positive or negative impact on the growth of the economy. And I thought that Congress would conclude that if you combine progressive tax cuts with a big wad of spending, the net is zero. They concluded we did it wrong. And the rest has been picked up by these folks.
I was just when I was there, we were still fighting what we thought was a good fighting, resisting dynamic scoring for tax cuts in particular. One excuse for that resistance was that the statute says we are be responsive to the budget committees, the appropriators, the tax writers. And so none of those committees were beating on us to say that felt to dynamic scoring. Part of my response too was that CBO has always done dynamic scoring. Because you look for effects, and they decide in particular how many people are going to sign up to a program. That's part of the assumptions. That's dynamic. I mean, in the sense of you're looking for the changes of people, whether they're paying taxes or building the economy. And but we resisted doing it. But we put in place a lot of the modeling we thought would be necessary. And then Doug wisely took the first presidential budget he had and used it to populate the models. So Doug took what the budget said, put it in the models, and produced the result we talked about, which was brilliant in many ways, something I never thought of. But it also opened the door, and I don't know where you close it. I mean, I look forward to Doug 2's paper on which programs might be amenable to it, and I can understand there would be. Immigration is a classic case of how many people go into the workforce. as a one component. But where do you stop? Where do you start? How much a dollar in education produces? Where? Spent in what way? I mean, it just again, I was not a big proponent of net scoring then, and I think it does open a Pandora's box occasionally.
As a footnote to this discussion, and in the spirit of what we heard from the panel of Horace, the most important thing we had to do to actually do the analysis is formal computational models require that the budget be on a sustainable trajectory, and then you can evaluate changes in it. So the first thing we had to do was essentially make up how is this thing going to be sustainable, because even then it wasn't, and now it's much, much worse.
Mr. Reischauer, I see you taking notes there.
Yeah, well, I served before this became a huge issue,
Uh-huh.
so I just looked with humor on the reactions of my successors, and I've always thought that this introduces even more uncertainty into an uncertain process. It is likely to increase controversy. It takes a lot of time and a lot of expertise, and you're likely to begin treating certain issues with a whole panoply of tools and others without that, because there isn't the data, there isn't the acceptance of the analysis. And, you know, that's all fine. But Congress likes it simple and it likes it fast. And it takes a long time to do a lot of these things. There's an outfit up at Yale that's just been formed, which I wish well, and they're very good people. And it will enlighten all of us, I think, and help CBO, you know, and the Congress moving forward. But I always viewed this a little bit like for cost estimating, it's the hamburger helper. You know, add a little bit of this, and maybe you can get more of what you want out of the cost estimate. And overall, the impact is not going to be huge on certain things. Doing analysis of immigration, very important. All for it. CBO has always done analysis of particular subjects that have shed additional light on the impacts overall beyond the budgetary impacts or secondary budgetary impact, and that's been useful.
Mr. Current Director, you said you wanted to.
Oh, I just one last observation, which I think builds on some of these others, which is that dynamic scoring. I mean, the dynamic scoring and other things, I think, highlights the secret. It's the secret sauce of CBO, which is not having normative views, which I mentioned before. And you know, as Bob said, having someone with normative views, if you say, well, you can do it this other thing and throw in other things, well, it's another this is channel for normative views to prevail. And not having normative views, you know, letting the chips fall where they may, is just such it really is the foundation of what we do. I'm sure it's the same in the past. The word basis, like that's the word that we use every day. Is what's the basis of that? It's just a generic CBO question, and you know, you have to be able to answer that question. In that sense, it's just the secret.
Well, just one small thing. I think when I started, there was the beginning of a requirement to do the dynamic budget.
I see.
And every single Democratic member I sat down and talked with had one question: how are you going to do the dynamic score? And the answer was, we'll give it a dynamic score and we'll give you the non-dynamic score.
I remember that. Yeah.
And it was all, oh, okay. Kind of like the real concern was one of trust. I mean, were we going to make it obvious what the dynamic effect was, and is it in a way where they could, frankly, just
So that was that satisfied everyone. I think the issue of transparency was brought up, alluded to earlier. My understanding is CBO does not publish its models, if I understand that correctly. I understand that CBO posts segments of the computer code for some analyses, but after nearly 50 years, should there be more competition as it relates to baseline scenarios? Should private forecasters, I think one of them was referenced, and others examine CBO's work and provide alternative views? I guess it's the idea of scientific reciprocity. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I think this is a horrific idea. So there is a big difference between transparency and scientific replicability, and I think people confuse those as being the same thing. They're not. Um, there's this presumption that there's a model for everything, and that's what CBO does. They turn on the model, and out comes the answer, and that's absolutely false. We hire, train, and pay the CBO staff who are fantastic, who exercise their judgment. Scoring is a judgment science. And you make a judgment about the most likely path for receipts and outlays as a result of a piece of legislation. And that's the job they do. Models can inform your judgment, and formal models are helpful in that regard. But I promise you, there is no model for scoring terrorism risk insurance. I mean, it's the federal backstop to the private property and casualty industry in the event of an unknown terrorist attack at an unknown time in an unknown location using an unknown weapon. Terry Gullick told me it was $50 billion. I believe her. Right. What else could it be? There's no model for that. So I mean, there is this misconception that there's a model for everything. You publish the model so other people can use the model, and they can then do scoring at home in their free time. That's not at all what is going on.
All right. Yes.
So can I echo and also add something? So the echo is Bob Sunshine, who's here and has been at CBO since 1976, I believe, served as deputy director with me, and everything good that I did, half the credit should go to Bob. Bob taught me when I came to CBO that models don't make estimates, estimators make estimates. It is the people who bring the judgment to bear in all these ways. So I think there should. I don't think it's a good idea myself if CBO published models, because people would presume they could then do a CBO estimate. But I would draw a little distinction with some of the outside groups. You mentioned the people at Yale who are just starting. There's a group at Penn, the Penn Wharton budget model people, who developed a lot of expertise. In fact, hired away some people from CBO, unfortunately, to help do that. I think having other groups trying to do some estimates in a serious way can be helpful. I mean, they have to demonstrate their own credibility. I think the folks at Wharton have definitely understand it. I think the folks at Yale have started last week, and we'll see. I think they have to build credibility, but I think it's good for other people to be trying to take seriously the challenge of taking some legislative proposals and assembling the evidence that's out there and trying to help offer information about them.
I want to just second that. I think that's really important. When I was director, essentially the only competition was OMB, and OMB, for a whole bunch of reasons, became less and less of a competitor, mostly because they don't do mandatories. So they're not doing most of the budget. They don't do the tax. So having these other groups to do benchmarking and comparisons with is really important.
I think one aspect of this, and it is a counter to what my colleagues have said, is that I do think there's some responsibility to make known some of the most critical, important assumptions. Not the code, not all of the judgment goes into it, but are these assumptions roughly correct? You have to make assumptions with a dynamic or with a system like this. You have to make assumptions to get the result. You can't observe everything in between. And so those assumptions often can affect, if not drive, the results. We ought to let people know what those assumptions are, because that's where you could accept legitimate input. You're not necessarily biased, doesn't matter the source. Are those assumptions right? What other data and studies can you bring to bear? I think that's an important piece of transparency at CBO, and Keith did a lot of this when he was there.
Yeah, and I agree. And to their credit from Congress, that was a lot of the feedback I got was not we want to see your models, but tell us what your assumptions are. That seems like the right thing to do.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the work of Penn Wharton is really incredibly good. They're very fast, and sometimes, sometimes they're, fast there's some trade-offs with being as fast as they are. And, in student loans, for example, we have data that we have data that Department of Education has, but doesn't really use fully, and others don't have it. So student loans is an example where we really have an advantage, just as the data. Actually, we're about to lose that advantage unless Congress passes legislation, which hopefully will happen, since now federal tax information. I'd say, again, Penn and is super big fan. Yale, their initial set of papers is great, is mostly really, really good. I say climate. So we do a lot of work on climate. It's something we started in the summer. Started more. They all, everyone before me did lots also, but I think we started more in the summer of 2019. Knowing that the administration was not going to put forward legislation for us to evaluate whatever, but knowing it would take time. And it's an area in which, of course, people working in the area have such strong normative views that I think we really have a place for doing that. And someone without normative views who's not an advocate, who really is just trying to get it right, that I think it's a really important area for CBO to basically keep doing what we're doing.
And I'll say one of the feedbacks I got from members was that we couldn't do work for them. We had to work for committees. We had to work on what was going to make it to the floor. And we pushed towards going beyond just the estimates. We get into interactives where you would set up a model, you'd set up a result and set up a little model that had give them an idea to see what happens if productivity is higher? What if it's lower? If nothing else, that gives them a feel for how confident we are in the number, how much uncertainty there is, because that's always a challenge. It's communicating uncertainty from these point estimates.
Okay, a question for the entire panel. I mean, obviously, you work in a political environment inherently. How hard is it to manage a nonpartisan, objective, independent organization that must advise and report to what is clearly a very partisan Congress in a partisan time? Keith, would you like to start with that?
Well, when things got controversial for me, frankly, a large part of my job was running interference for staff.
What do you mean?
I would spend a lot of time in a member's office. Somebody was upset. I would go explain things to them. I would be careful about bringing people with me because I didn't want them exposed, honestly, to somebody's angry with their result, because I wanted to be fearless in what they were doing, that they were making the right.
To not shrink back in anticipation of somebody's reaction.
Exactly. And when things got bad, we even brought in speakers who would, to be honest, tell CBO how great they are. So to remind them.
So like Tony Robbins would come into the CBO and
to remind them that they're doing good work and they shouldn't be afraid.
That's not how I roll.
All right, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, how do you roll in this partisan environment?
So I just want to echo that, it is your job to, the director signs everything, the director owns everything, and it is your job to defend everything. It is not the staff's, and it is utterly inappropriate for any elected official to go after a CBO staffer. That's a line that I just will not tolerate. It was pretty easy for me, to be honest. People have asked me a lot over the years, sort of, how do you think about being CBO director? Would you be CBO director again? I always told them no, because one of the things that made it possible for me to do my job is I didn't know anybody on Capitol Hill. I didn't give a rat's ass about anyone on Capitol Hill. My peers were out in the research community, and I wanted them to be proud of the work that we did. And that's exactly the right mindset to have.
Huh.
And I couldn't do it now. I know too many people, and I would care what they thought. I didn't care, and that made it much, much easier. So take care of your people, stick to the research and findings, and you do a good job.
I'm getting the wrap, so I'm going to ask for closing thoughts from each of you about the way forward. Always want to end on leaning forward. And start with you, Mr. Reischauer.
I agree with, I think, the universal judgment that CBO, the creation and the development of CBO is really the high point of budget accomplishments in the last 50 years. And it owes a lot of the success to the founding director, Alice Rivlin, and the markers that she put down. It wasn't written that this was going to be a nonpartisan as opposed to a bipartisan. Number of inquiries I got about bipartisan in the first few years was amazing. It was not given in stone that CBO would not make recommendations. It was not apparent that CBO would speak independently. The first product we produced actually came out in a committee print when we actually put out a pamphlet of our own on some topic. Many were surprised. There are a lot of things which people, the law did not specify what we were supposed to do, and the House and the Senate didn't agree anyway. And just to give you one example, it never occurred to Mellis or me or any of the other founding people that we wouldn't do an independent economic forecast upon which our estimates would be based. We happen to have Alan Blinder here as a visiting fellow, and Frank DeLeo from GW came as a head of the fiscal policy staff. We put together an economic forecast. It was leaked to the Washington Star, and the chairman of the
I
budget
remember that
committee,
paper. Yeah.
uh, chairman of the budget committee, Ed Muskie, called up Alice when he heard about this, and I was sitting in her office, and he said, "What the hell are you guys doing? Why are you putting out an economic forecast? We have the president's." You know, Alice pointed out that the Congress might want its independent forecast. President was Republican, Muskie was not. It was a controversy until 6 years later when David Stockman introduced us all to Rosy Scenario, that having a separate independent view, more like the blue chip consensus, would have some value for Congress. So there were lots of things that were decided and then built upon by a set of directors. And the directors, to a person, reflected Doug One's view. They cared about what their colleagues before CBO would think of them and their independence. And no matter what kind of baggage or views that they might have as they came into office, they were going to do the most down the middle, sophisticated, intelligible analysis that is what Congress should want. And it turns out Congress did want it. They didn't always know it, but over the years, it has been really quite supportive at the same time as being critical. And,
Yeah.
I think all of us spend a lot of time in members' offices dealing largely with the staff's displeasure that something CBO had done. And the member nodding the whole time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reischauer. And just studying up in the days leading up to this, I realized that everybody owes you and Ms. Rivlin a debt of gratitude for your establishing. Mr. Crippen, final thoughts.
Well, you reflected what my first thought was, which is Bob gives Alice a lot of credit, and rightfully so. But he was also sitting there with her much of that time and deserves a lot of the credit for as well for establishing the benchmarks and processes that we inherited and still use.
Okay.
I mean, all of us, of course, think that CBO is a valuable institution, has been and will, we hope, continue to be. The only thing that I can think of offhand that I would advocate for is more of some of what we've said here about revealing assumptions. Spending a little more attention, at least from my time there, to what others have to say. It can be a bit of a cloistered institution. You have to protect not only the staff, and it is up to the director to absorb the incoming, but you also have critics of other kinds that may have legitimate things to say. And we can't just deny that. And I'm not saying that's all the case, but I think we do need to worry about taking more.
Okay, I'm getting a hard, in the TV business, we call this a hard wrap. So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds or so if there's something else you'd like to conclude with.
CBO is so good at its mission that people are always tempted to give it another one. That would be the biggest mistake. Let it do its job and continue to do its job.
All right, Doug, too?
I think the power of CBO comes from its staff. It comes not from the half dozen of us here. It's the 200, 300 people who've made the place what it is, who helped the director stand up to members of Congress because the analysis is good, who have knowledge and understanding way beyond what any of us, I believe, could put in our own heads. And the power of CBO in the future is to make sure that it keeps attracting the best possible staff. Thank you.
Keith?
Well, I've been always impressed with how much that CBO does now. It did from the very beginning because they kind of got it right. The one thing we haven't mentioned that I think they take on very well is accountability. They evaluate their estimates. They evaluate their projections. How did they do? And not too many places do that.
Great.
Yeah.
Final word to the current director.
I'll just end and just say, I think the key for us is to take a long view, and as they all said, to keep doing what our mission is, and to stay focused on that, and do it the way that, well, really that Alice set it up.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. That was
Thank you.
very, very.